Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here alongside Tim Baker. Welcome to this week's segment of the Rx Money Roundup on the YFP podcast, where we give you our take on relevant financial news and updates, answer your questions, and break down examples of financial planning in action. Today, we're going to be talking about what the data has to say about the purchasing power of a pharmacist's salary and whether or not it's eroding to inflation and stagnant wages. But before we do that, let me give a shout out to our financial planning and tax professionals at YFP that make this segment possible. At YFP, we support pharmacists at every stage of their careers to take control of their finances, reach their financial goals, and build wealth through comprehensive fee-only financial planning and tax planning. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com. All right, Tim, this week we're going to be discussing a poster presentation that actually came from the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, their annual meeting, AACP, that's held in July of each year. And this poster that was presented on the topic of the purchasing power of pharmacists' annual wages over the past 20 years. So this was a team of researchers from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore School of Pharmacy, South College, Nova, West Virginia, and Loyola University. And the objective, again, of the research was to examine how has the purchasing power of a pharmacist's salary evolved over the last 20 years with the data that we have available. So just as a point of reference, the data that they used to aggregate for this study came from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you're curious, you can look that up at bls.gov, as well as historical consumer price index values, CPI values. And they essentially took the historical salary wages that are published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and converted them to today's value. So, if we had a 2005 pharmacist salary, they converted those wages to today's value. 2023 is at the time of the research that they looked at. Now, here were their findings, and I want to talk about what we can take away from this. Their findings were that there was a gradual increase in the purchasing power of a pharmacist's income between 2003 and 2015, so over that 12-year span. And then there's been a gradual decrease since then. So from 2015 to 2023, they found a gradual decrease down from about $153,000. Again, remember, these are adjusted dollars to today's value in 2015, all the way down to 134, about 135 in 2023. So the last thing they note that's relevant is, despite the decrease, the trend that they've seen going down in the purchasing power of a pharmacist's salary, it's still higher than it was at that point in 2003. So we can almost think about this, right, as somewhat of a bell curve. It went up and now it's kind of come back down, but it's still higher than where it was back in 2003. Tim, before I get your take, I just want to note a couple things that we need to consider here, right? When we think about the profession of pharmacy, we had the adoption of the PharmD degree in the early 2000s. With that, we had a significant shortage at the time, which led to sign-on bonuses, salaries going up, other things about the time I graduated in 2008. So that obviously is contributing in part to that trend that we saw between 2003, 2015. Now that has since changed, right, a little bit. And we had a period where that went down. And now we see actually community pharmacies picking back up some of those sign-on bonuses and other things to try to recruit people into that part of the workforce. So Tim, why don't we start with, why is purchasing power significant, and what do you take away from this data about the potential impact on pharmacists?
Yeah, I think it's significant. It's basically how far your money can go, right? So, we talk about, I spoke with a prospective client that, had almost $200,000 in cash just sitting in a checking account, and every year that sit there,
Yeah.
that erodes, right? Because you have inflation, it's not really earning anything, and that's why we invest, is to kind of keep in front of the inflation monster and the tax man,
Mhm.
and really get that exponential level of growth. So we this is one of the things that we feel. I just had a conversation with my wife about you know groceries, and she's like, man, the same groceries used to cost $100, now they're costing $130.
Yeah.
And so we feel that more than some of the other things that might be going on in our financial life, like our net worth growing. You don't necessarily feel that's in the background. So this affects our day to day, and one of the, groceries are one of those things. Gas is one of those things, because we drive by it, every day, and we can kind of see the numbers go up and down. So it affects our mood, so to speak. Right now, we're in an election cycle. So, one party is saying it's okay, the other party is saying it's not, that type of thing. So there's a lot at play here. And, I think if you think about it at a macro level, if you, in terms of the financial plan, if you are allocated more dollars to quote unquote fixed expenses that are gradually going up, and obviously you have variable expenses, that means you have less um, to potentially apply to things like invest in, right? A lot
Yep.
of people, especially if they're investing primarily through their 401k, that's money that's coming right out of the top. It's not necessarily hitting your paycheck. But beyond that, you don't really have the quote unquote disposable income to invest or do the things that also make a wealthy life today, like, home improvements, going on trips, having experiences, that type of
Yeah.
thing. So it is very important both in the short term and the long term kind of outlook. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, like, we feel this the most because it kind of affects our everyday checking account. I would say my take, Tim, on the study is I'm a little bit surprised. Not I'm a little bit surprised by the slow, like, increase in purchasing power and then the slow decrease in purchasing power. And the reason I say this, and I didn't go back, in terms of my research in the same amount of time that the study was done, but I look back 10 years in terms, because, like, when you think of the things about like when you think at things about erosion, it's like, okay, what are you comparing against? And really what you're comparing against is inflation, right? So um when you go back to 2014, inflation was, and 2015, it was less than 1%, 0.8%, 0.7%. And then from 2016 to 2019, you were at
Mm.
2.1, 2.1, 1.9, 2.3. And then it dropped in
Boom.
2020
Mm-hmm.
for COVID because there was significant decrease in demand for goods and services. And then and this is where I'm like, the we should see more of an increase, because in 2021 and 2022, which is part of the study, it goes up to 7%, up to 6.5%. And I'm using the CPI
Mm-hmm.
index, but it goes up to 7 and 6.5%. And then 2023 comes back down to 3.2%, and then we're on track for about a 2.3 inflation for this year. And the Fed wants it to be kind of in that 2 to 3% range. So I'm surprised by not the gradual purchasing power increase, but we went from twos to triple that, and we held that for 2 years, which was part of the study. And maybe we're still not yet seeing the lag and effects. Because one of the questions, or
Oh,
one of
same
the
thing.
things that I hear, and again, we have it in our household, is why, if inflation is down, and it was down 3.2 and then 2.3, it's trending for 2024. Why do things still feel expensive? And part of that is wage growth lag. So although wages have increased in many sectors, they often can't keep pace with the rapid price of prices increasing. I think the other thing too is that there are certain parts of the economy where prices have come down,
Yeah, that's
but
right.
where they haven't, and I think food is one of those. But wages is a lagging indicator here. I think the other thing is the cumulative effect of previous inflation. So when we had those two bumps, those services go up, but they don't necessarily come down. They're sticky.
That's it right
So
there. Yep.
so people are like, man, before I was paying X for a gallon of milk or whatever, or maybe it's not something that's so subsidized, but I was paying X for, a cut of meat, but now I'm paying so much more. And it's like, just because it goes up doesn't necessarily it's going to come down. I think businesses too are reluctant to reduce prices because of their own costs. Labor, we know labor right now, and you're seeing a lot of automation. I think Tim, I went down to like Wendy's here, and it was all like, you go through the drive-thru, it was all like AI, and I was like, I'm in the future. Like, you're seeing, and my brother visited from Portland, and he's like, in Portland, Oregon, like, you go to a restaurant and it's all like, you go up and you order somewhere and you bust your own, like, that's because of the labor shortages,
Yep.
and at kind of like those minimum wage jobs. I think the other thing too is, during COVID, we had that, logistical nightmare of not being able to, get get product through our system. I think the other thing that I think a lot of employers are worried, or businesses are worried about, is in an election year, is there going to be potential chaos that comes from that, that's going to essentially drive up prices? So maybe they're in this dip where the prices aren't necessarily what they're charging, but I think they're anticipating some type of volatility with the election year. So I think there's other things that are going on here, psychological anchoring, where people remember prices from the before, and they kind of get stuck on
Totally.
that. Or like I was mentioned, selective price sensitivity. So like things like groceries, gas, and
Hmm.
utilities, like if those are high, even though as a percentage it might not be as big of a deal compared to everything else we spend money on, like that's things. So I think there's a lot of things at play here, but I think my big takeaway, to make a longer answer longer, is like I was a little bit shocked by that there wasn't more of a like a bigger
Fall.
kind of
Yeah.
sentiment of erosion in those years towards the end of the study.
I'm so glad you mentioned the inflation thing because I think that we get confused with, what this actually means. Obviously from the household standpoint, right? We're asking the same question, although we've
Yeah,
got, boys that are eating us out of the house right now, but like it doesn't feel like things are cheaper. Well, guess what? They're not. Like we didn't have negative inflation. It
right,
just means that it's slowed down, right?
right. Yep.
Over the last couple of years. And you mentioned the wages potentially lagging. Um, I think your point about the fixed costs is one we've got to talk more about because, I see this a lot in pharmacists that I talk with, Tim, where there can be this perception that I think is still hanging out there of, hey, I make a great income, which is true, right? Objectively speaking, when you look at a pharmacist salary as reported by the BLS, they're making on average more than $50,000 more than the average household income in the US. So is it still a
Right,
good income? It is. What we see though from this data is that it doesn't go as far as it used to, at least looking back, say 10 years. Now, if you look all the way back 20 years, it does, right? And that was a point the authors were making. But for those that maybe graduated in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, you actually might feel like it doesn't go as far as it does. Now, what I see consistently is the challenge around the fixed costs. And this is where I think inflation can impact people differently, right? Because if you have someone who, let's say, graduated in 2010, 2012, maybe they bought a home, they had a 30-year mortgage, they refinanced that at some point when the rates were low, and they have one of the biggest fixed expenses at a very low interest rate and obviously a lower purchase price than what would be today. And then you put that up against a 2018, 2019, 2020 grad, anyone in the last 4 or 5 years, right? Obviously rates have come up. That budget line for fixed costs is going to go up significantly. And so when you think about inflation, right, and cost of goods going up, that's not impacting somebody that has a 30-year fixed mortgage at 2.9% in the same way that it is someone else, right? Because of how big that is as a percentage of their expenses and their line items.
Yeah, and the not only that, but like because I think of the housing shortage in a lot of markets, it's a supply and demand issue there where houses are going to go up. I always look back at what my parents paid for their house in 1978, which is it's like a car today, right? But like not only are you paying, and again, I still think that even rates at 7-8% are still, they're not historically low, but they're still on the
Yeah.
lower, not double digits. But when you tack on the fact that housing has kind of outpaced inflation because of things
Yeah.
like like the housing shortage, and then you tack on the interest on top of that, that's where it kind of gets, that's where that fixed, that it's a bigger piece of the
Yeah.
pie in terms of your fixed expenses. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there are things that are there are things that are unique to pharmacy and a career in pharmacy and what you earn, and then there's things that are more macro that are just the economic system in which we sit. I think though, I think what we're seeing in the pharmacy job landscape, and I'm not an expert obviously, but I read and we talk to a lot of pharmacists obviously, is there is that what's the narrative that the media is pushing about pharmacist shortage, which we know is not necessarily the case. We just know that there's a lot of people that don't want some of these jobs in places that people are saying there's a shortage, um, because of working conditions and things like that. So that's part of it. But then what we also know is what the report is saying is that the demand for pharmacists is not as robust as it once was. And when we changed to the PharmD, there was this explosion of pharmacy schools that came on, and we have graduating pharmacists every year. That I wouldn't say it's flooded the market, but I pulled out a number from the study that said, just looking at it year over year, in 2020, in the second quarter of 2024, there was job postings of 18,681. The previous year, it was 20,541. So what that's saying is that there is, and when you have that, if there's more supply of pharmacists, that means that wages are not going to be as competitive as maybe they once were. And then I think if you tack on things like AI and other things that are playing a part, I think that is, overly can be problematic from a, hey, are my wages keeping pace with what I have? And I do think the other thing, Tim, is, when we talk about a pharmacist, typically six figures of income off the jump, but six figures of debt. And,
which is
if you
not
look at,
factored into this study.
which is not factored into the study, but like, if you think about it from a purchasing power perspective, if the average is, 170,000, if we look at a 10-year standard plan, at 6% interest, that's just under $2,000 a month for 10 years. So 24 grand, a year for 10 years. So I look at that as, and I look at that as purchasing power. Whereas you go back in the early 2000s, like we've talked about this ad nauseum, the price of doing business, the cost of doing business wasn't that high. So I think you have to pay for that on the back end, which is unfortunately an erosion of your overall compensation and income, if you look at it from that perspective as well.
And I think that's where some of the challenge comes in with the fixed cost. You gave the student loan example, which of course not everyone's on a standard repayment plan.
Correct. Yep.
But just for the sake of discussion, like,
yep.
If you think about the average pharmacist take home pay, after tax take home pay, you're probably somewhere between 7 and 8-ish thousand, right? So student loan payment, you just gave an example, about 2,000. You had a house, you had childcare costs, you had a car, right? Those are typically the big four that we see. And it's no wonder that you might have 60 to 80%, if not more, of your take-home pay that's tied up in fixed costs, and have that nagging feeling of, hey, I make a good income, but I don't feel like I have much breathing room, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we got our work cut out. And I think that is one of the limitations of this study is, it's not factoring in things like student loan debt, which makes sense because when you're looking at the BLS data, it's not slicing it as those who do and don't have debt, and those that are, it's looking at the average, the mean wages over time. So great discussion. We actually have a note out to the authors to try to get permission to post their poster as a part of the show notes. So take a look at the show notes when we go to publish this. If that's available, it'll be there for you. Thanks again for taking some time to listen. If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming episode, send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask. And as we wrap up this week's episode, an important reminder that the content is provided for informational purposes only, not intended to provide, should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day.